Well, this betrays a commitment to net zero. There's no ambiguity about the fact that all of the scientists have said, the UN, Guterres has said, the Climate Change Committee, government's own statutory body in the UK, Lord Devon's report has recently said that fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. So granting licenses for further exploration and then potential exploitation is abject madness. The world is on fire. We are watching this nightly on our screens. All over the world, raging temperatures, sea temperatures higher than ever before. We're in a climate breakdown crisis, and what we need here is strong leadership. And I'm afraid we've not seen that for humanity today.
And Chris, this carbon capture thing is quite technical, but they're saying, the government's saying, if we get our power closer to home, we don't have to ship it, it's much better for the environment. Well, what's your take on what they're saying on that?
Well, carbon capture is an unproven technology. There is a plant operating in Norway which is storing a million tons of CO2 a year, but it's not extracting it from oil and gas that's burned. It's extracting it at source. The UK releases somewhere in the region of 40 million tons of carbon every year. So that's not working. That technology is just not advanced to the point where it's a solution at this point. We do have solutions, of course. We have solar, we have wind, to some extent we've got wave. Those renewable energies are out there and they're on the table. That's where we ought to be investing rapidly at this point in time. Also, the Acorn project, which the Prime Minister has said that the UK public will now start to fund, is essentially run by the fossil fuel giants, Shell, Equinor, ExxonMobil. I mean, these guys are making enough profits that they didn't ought to be subsidised by the UK taxpayer. Indeed, they ought to be taxed even more to subsidise the transition that we need to make away from those fossil fuels to renewables.
Chris, let me put some of the messages we've been getting on the 5 phone to you from our viewers. George in Kenilworth, Sunak flies to Scotland by private jet to grant oil and gas production licences. Does it look like he cares? Ian in Birmingham, we're just a tiny little island. We're doing more than enough. Let's look at China and other large countries. Julie in Eastbourne, the policy isn't dead. We need gas until 2035, so we're drilling for it rather than buying it at ridiculous cost. That last one is a key point that the Prime Minister's been talking about today. I mean, that is a fair point, surely.
Well, transition is the word. We all know that as much as we'd like to be able to just turn off the tap on oil and gas tomorrow, it's entirely unrealistic. But what we do need to do is expedite that transition, and therefore exploring for more of it and, intimating that we're going to exploit more of it, it is, as I've said, abject madness. There's no doubt about that. Look, this is a setup, which is profitable. The opportunity for old jobs in bad business. There are plenty of opportunities looking forward for new jobs in bright new businesses in those renewable sectors, in the environmental sector, and that's where we ought to be pursuing that. That needs bold, brave leadership, not continuing to do something which is without any ambiguity not just bad for the UK but bad for the entire planet. And when people start wagging the finger at China, I've got to tell you that China spends more on the development of renewable energy than every other country on the planet put together. You know why? Because they've got their finger on the pulse and they know where the future is going. And as a consequence of that, we all trying to lead in these fields. I can tell you, in the UK, we've got one wind turbine manufacturer, just one in the UK. It's owned by a friend of mine, Dale Vince. It's been making a loss for the last 13 years because we cannot get onshore wind running. And that's, again, down to government policy. We've got to change this. We need to build a brighter future for our children.
Sorry, Chris. Couple more messages here. Debbie in Nottingham. I personally don't think the government is taking it seriously. Why has this been left so late? Why don't we speak to other countries to find out what they're doing? Tim in Birmingham, we should keep the rigs and secure our own destiny instead of relying on other countries who are going to let us down. On that last issue, Chris, is this a vote winner, vote loser, do you think, at the next election? I mean, clearly the government thinks it's onto something here.
I think that we're at a turning point in global politics. We saw in Australia an election turn perhaps on environmental issues for the very first time in the wake of those disastrous wildfires that swept through the country and its dependence on coal. I think that whenever the election arises in this country, our politicians will need to be wise to the fact that, yes, we're concerned about the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, the NHS and everything else, but now the vast majority of people in the UK are scared about what's happening when it comes to our climate breakdown. And therefore, the wise would put something meaningful into their mouths, which would allow us to make a democratic choice about our future on planet Earth.
Just quickly, Chris, they're sort of clean air rather than climate, aren't they? But these LTNs, ULEZs, lots of our viewers will be aware of this. What is your view on these policies and the possibility of getting rid of them?
It's a mix of environment, obviously, and as you mentioned, health issues. 30,000 people a year die of respiratory problems due to poor air quality in the UK. Lots of young people, children suffering from asthma. This has to be addressed. There's no ambiguity about that whatsoever. We could transition to electric vehicles in those zones. That would help tremendously. The government hasn't invested on the infrastructure there. But one thing, let's be clear about this. This mustn't be a tax on the poor. Those people who need to be helped through that transition, in this case, changing their vehicles from diesel to something which is less polluting, need to be subsidised. And you know who I think should pay? Those fossil fuel giants that at this moment are posting record profits. Centrica last week, record profits. Shell, BP, all of them, billions and billions. A windfall tax on those fossil fuel giants to subsidise the ordinary working people trying to make changes in their life to make this planet a livable place to be. That's what needs to happen. Bold political moves like that.
Chris Packham, always passionate, always interesting. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.